Hi everyone, my name is Ike Trek and I make my own clothes. This is the second and final part of making myself a brand new pair of Selvedge denim jeans. In the first part, I did the front pockets, the back pockets, and assembled the backs as well. And in this part, I'm going to finish them. Stick around to the end to see the finished product.
First up is finishing off the edge of the buttonhole placket. I like to do a blanket stitch by hand to finish my edge, but there's lots of different things you could do. A serger is probably the easiest, but I don't have a serger. I've also seen people use like a little bit of tape to bind this edge. You could also cut one of the edges a little larger and fold it underneath and then top stitch it down. But I like a little bit of handwork. And then I can lay out my buttonholes. I've drawn out my spacing on the pattern. One thing I will say is I like that top buttonhole to be a lot closer to the waist seam than I think a lot of commercial jeans have it. Usually it's sort of equidistantly spaced with the other buttonholes, but I make mine about 3/4 of an inch from from the seam line. I find this helps with gapping. And then I can put in my buttonholes. I do all my buttonholes by hand, partially because I don't have a machine that does them, but I also think that a hand sewn buttonhole is superior to a machine worked buttonhole. The only advantage that a sewing machine has is that it's a lot faster. I also like hand sewing because you can do it anywhere. I worked these sitting in my favorite park in Madison, and it was absolutely beautiful outside. I'm going to make a whole video at some point talking about how I hand sew buttonholes, so stay tuned for that. And then with the buttonholes done, I can actually start putting together the fly. First thing I'm going to do is clip into my seam allowances, just slightly shorter than my fly pieces. I don't like to clip into my seam allowance until I start working on the fly. On the buttonhole side, I'm going to clip into 3/4 of an inch, which is my seam allowance, but on the button side, I'm only going to clip into 1/2 an inch, and that's going to create an overlap. And then on the buttonhole side, I can go ahead and double turn that 3/4 inch seam allowance and press it. And then I can go ahead and top stitch that edge down, stopping level with where I clipped into the seam allowance. Now I'm doing this work from the exterior because sometimes I think it looks a bit cleaner on my machine that way. And then I can go ahead and position the buttonhole placket in and pin it in place. The big thing here is I want the edge of the buttonhole placket to sit just inside the outer edge. And then I can go ahead and top stitch that buttonhole placket into place. I started inside the seam allowance for the fronts, and then I'm just going all the way around the outer edge. And I'm sticking pretty close to the edge. I'm doing this from the interior because I find it a lot easier that way. And then I can go ahead and add a second line of top stitching. I'm doing this one from the exterior, just using my presser foot as a guide to maintain consistent spacing. You don't need to do 2 lines of top stitching. Oh, some pants don't, but most jeans do. And then I can start assembling the button placket. I cut one of my edges on the selvage, so I'm just turning and pressing this thing in half with the raw edge just inside the selvage. And then I can go ahead and stitch the bottom closed. Before I turn that placket right sides out, I'm going to clip the corners and press open that seam allowance on the bottom, which should make it easier to turn. And then I can turn it right side out and press it so it's nice and flat and ready to install. And then I'm going to go ahead and position that and pin it in place. The edges of the front are going to sit just inside the selvage edge of the placket, which will sort of hide the raw edges, but I'll finish those by hand later. And then I can go ahead and stitch that buttonhole placket on at 1/2 an inch seam allowance. Below where I clipped into the seam allowance, I move that seam allowance out of the way and just stitch through the placket, but when I get above it, I stitch through all of the layers. And then from the exterior, I like to top stitch along that seam. It helps manage some of the bulk and make sure the seam allowances are going the direction that I want them to, in this case, towards the side seam. And then I'm going to stop level with where I clipped into the seam allowance. To finish off the raw edges of that button placket, I'm just going to do a blanket stitch by hand again. With that done, I can start putting the two fronts together. I'm putting them so they are right sides together with the buttonhole side on top of the button side. Um, with the rest of my flat felled seams, I do wrong sides together, but this is the one that I like to do right sides together because I find it's a little bit easier to get everything aligned that way. What I'm looking for is to have the center front of the buttonhole side just inside this line of top stitching on the button side. I also want to put the buttonhole side just a little bit lower than the button side. The big reason for this is sometimes I found if I make them exactly even at this point, when I finish it and flip everything out, the buttonhole side can be a little bit high. And then I'm just going to go ahead and put a couple pins to keep everything in place. And then I can go ahead and stitch those together at 3/4 of an inch, starting just inside and under the folded edge of the buttonhole side. And then I'm going to trim the seam allowance of the buttonhole side in half or just under half. And then I went ahead and put some clips into the longer seam allowance, should help everything lay smoother when it's then turned over the trim seam allowance and pressed. And I want to stop that edge just inside my first line of stitching. And then from the exterior, I can top stitch along that seam, stopping just past where I clipped into my seam allowance. I'll stop with the needle and the fabric, turn the whole piece, take a couple stitches back and forth across there, and then turn the piece and come down the other side of the seam allowance, still from the exterior, and that should encase all of the raw edges. With the fronts and backs done, I can start putting them together. I'm going to start with the inseam. I like to put a couple pins on either side of the center front, center back seam, just to make sure those are aligned. And then I like to pin down at the hem next, and then work towards the center. Just in case the front and back legs ended up different lengths, I can usually work out the difference along the thigh where the fabric is on a bit of a bias. And then I can go ahead and stitch those together. I use a 3/4 inch seam allowance for all of my flat felt seams. It's a bit wider than most people do, but I found the extra width to be helpful with really bulky areas like when you have flat felt seams on top of flat felt seams. And then, like the center front seam, I can go ahead and trim one of my seam allowances in half or just under half. And then I can go ahead and turn the longer seam allowance over the trimmed seam allowance and press it. And I'm stopping so the edge is just inside that first line of stitching. And then I can go ahead and stitch down the other side of the seam allowance to finish off the seam. This is one of the flat felled seams that I usually don't press flat before I stitch it. I'll just sort of smooth and flatten everything as I'm sewing it. The sort of center with where all of the flat felled seams meet is something I definitely like to hammer flat before I stitch it. Makes it just a little bit easier to get through. With the inseam done, I can go ahead and turn the jeans inside out and pin the side seams. I like to put a pin in at the hem and then pin the waist. Do a couple pins down from the waist, do a couple pins up from the hem, just making sure that everything is distributed evenly and laying flat. And then I can go ahead and stitch that. I use a 1/2 inch seam allowance for everything that's not a flat felled seam. My sewing machine plate doesn't have seam lines or seam guides, so I just put down a piece of masking tape to use as a seam guide. And I usually switch it after I do the inseam from 3/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch for the side seams and the waistband. And then after the side seams are stitched, I like to finish those edges off together. The hip curve is going to be raw, as well as the edges of the pocket bag. And I'm just doing a blanket stitch by hand again. And then to finish off the side seam before I put the waistband on, I like to top stitch from the exterior so that the seam allowance is pressed towards the back. This helps deal with some of the bulk over the hips and just make sure that everything is pointing in the same direction. I like to do the stitching up to where the pocket bags cut away from the side seam. And then I can press that side seam open, and I'm pressing just up to the bottom of the pocket bag. Since there's top stitching there, I can't really press it open any further. then I can make my belt loops. I like my finished belt loops to be about 3/8 of an inch wide, so I'm starting by turning up and pressing 3/8 of an inch. You can see I've chalked a line that I can press to. I like to use the selvage edge to finish off the raw edge of the belt loop. That you could totally use a serger here or give it an extra little fold. And then I'm just going to turn that and press it again. So I've got 3 layers of fabric. I like to cut the piece wider than I need. And then after I've done this second fold, I can go ahead and trim off the excess right next to the folded edge. And then after that's done, I can tuck the raw edge that's on top underneath the selvage edge. And then I'll go ahead and give it another press. And my goal with this is to roll the selvage edge all the way over to the exterior edge. So it's sitting right along that edge. And then I can go ahead and stitch those belt loops. I'm starting on the back side and just stitching down the selvage, and then I'll flip it over and put a second line of top stitching. And then I can go ahead and mark and trim those down to size. I made a strip long enough to do all 5 of my belt loops. I like to stitch my belt loops into the waist seam when I'm putting on the waistband. So before I put that on, I'm going to pin my belt loops into position. And then I can start working on the waistband. I like to put some chalk marks in where all of the seams should be. It makes things easier to line up. And then I'm going to start by putting the pieces right sides together, starting at the center front on the buttonhole side, lining it up with my chalk mark, putting a pin in, and then I'll go around and match the seams to the chalk marks I put, and then I can distribute pins in between there to make sure everything is evenly distributed and laying flat. You can see I've cut my waistband longer than I need it, but we'll deal with that later. And then I can go ahead and stitch that waistband on. Again, I'm using 1/2 inch seam allowance for this. I don't think you need anything wider. You can see I've got the pants flipped so they're inside out with the waistband sitting on top. I've found that's the easiest way to do it. But yeah, stitching that all the way around, moving the pants as needed so everything is laying flat. With that stitched on, I can go ahead and press everything so it's laying flat, and then the seam allowance is pressed up towards the waistband. And then moving on to the center fronts, I mentioned earlier that I'd cut this a little bit long, so I'm just trimming that. And then I can fold in the seam allowance over the center fronts and press it. And then I can do the same thing with the other center front as well, just turning in the seam allowance and pressing it. You want a nice straight line here. After that's all pressed, I can go ahead and fold the waistband in half, bringing the interior edge just below my first line of stitching. Now I'm using the selvage edge on the inside here, but you can totally use a folded edge as well. And then I'll go back and do that same thing on the other center front. And then I'll usually press the center back and then press out from there just so everything's laying flat. Now, I didn't manage to get any footage of it on this pair of pants, but the next thing I like to do is to run a line of basting stitches through the length of the waistband. This just allows me to make sure that everything is in the right spot. It also gives me a chance to double check that that edge is exactly where I want it. You could totally use pins here, but I like basting a little bit better. Pins don't lay entirely flat, while basting does. To finish off the waistband, I'll just top stitch from the exterior all the way around, and that should catch the interior edge and finish everything off. I like to start and stop underneath a belt loop just so it's a little bit less noticeable. If things don't go perfectly, you can always take it back to the most recent belt loop to restart. That way it's not even noticeable that you did that. And then I can stitch down the belt loops. It's sort of a pain on this machine because it isn't ever reverse, so I have to stop with the needle and the fabric and spin the piece every time to change direction. But I'll just go back and forth over each end of the belt loop a couple times. This is definitely something that I like to hammer flat before I stitch, especially even on this machine, which can handle heavyweight stuff pretty well. I find sometimes it's a bit much stitching through all these layers. With the belt loops done, I can start working on the hems. I'm just double turning those and pressing them. I do a 1/2 inch hem on my jeans. With that all pressed, I can go ahead and stitch it. I like to start and stop at the inseam. It's a little bit less noticeable that way. But then I'm just stitching all the way around the hem. And with the hem done, all of the machine work is done. Next up, it's time to attach the buttons. I did the buttonhole that's on the waistband off camera. To mark the position of my buttons, I'm just using a chalk pencil that I got at the art supply store. I really like this. It fits in the buttonholes well and leaves a nice clear mark. So on the buttons, I'm using the same heavy linen thread that I worked the buttonholes in. It's heavy enough that I find that I don't need to double my thread. I don't like to tie a knot if I don't have to, and I found that stitching through the same spot will anchor my thread well enough. To actually attach the button, I'll just pass my needle through one of the holes and then back down through the one across from it. And I'll do this a couple times, working from the front to the back, back to the front. And I found with a thread this heavy, I don't need to do too many passes, maybe 3 or 4 in each direction. And then I can bring the thread up from the back, wrap it around a couple times to create a shank, and then I can knot it off on the back. And that creates a nice secure button. And then the last thing I do is stitch in this label that I made. It's my initials cross-stitched by hand in blue silk on a bit of hemp canvas. And I've done this in pretty much every single garment I've made over the past couple years. It's less so a logo or any sort of branding, but more of a signature. I think so often the labor that goes into making clothing is anonymous, especially with mass-produced stuff. So after putting all the work into this garment, I like the idea that my name is going to be attached to it. To attach this, I'm actually using a herringbone stitch in the same blue silk that I worked the initials in. The letters themselves are based on samplers from the 18th and 19th century. And with that done, this project is all finished. And here's what they look like on. Overall, I'm pretty happy with the fit, though I feel like there's always things that I would have done differently. In this case, I think the waist might be just a little too big, but I'm so happy with how these turned out. But let me know what you think, and let me know if you have any questions as well.